Welcome to MeatsPad, a platform dedicated to sharing breakthrough knowledge that is accessible to the meats industry. On each episode, we will hear from meat specialists and professionals to talk about numerous topics in meat science. This podcast is brought to you by the U.S. Meat Export Federation, the National Provisioner, Ultrasource, the new standard for innovation,
IFA, Meat Processing Power.
Carrie's food protection and preservative business keeps food safe and extends shelf life through clean label and conventional preservative solutions. Viscofan is a global leader and innovative partner in the food industry who provides solutions for the casing market.
Hello, meat folks. Welcome back to the MeatsPad podcast. Today, I'm going solo with this episode. Dr. Baz wasn't able to join today. I'm very excited because we have two individuals that they mean a lot to me, mean a lot to my program during my PhD. Most recently, I got to know Dr. Detwiler. That's going to be on with Dr. Randall Phebus from K-State. Welcome, everyone. How are you today?
Very good.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you for having us.
So we haven't covered much about food safety, and I think that down in the future we'll be touching more about the importance of food safety. We cover a little bit about the antimicrobial interventions. We talk about some of the things that small meat science meat processors have to consider when it comes to food safety. And I think today we'll talk about a little bit about the story of HACCP, why HACCP started. And just to give you guys a little bit of a background, so during my master's thesis at K-State, I did a study on pork carcass storage, and Dr. Phebus was on my committee, and I got exposed to the food safety world working with Dr. Phebus, although I'm a meat scientist, but I think it's very important to be a little bit of well-rounded and be able to defend ourselves when it comes to that. And I think so the topic of today will be basically talking about that. And Dr. Detwiler, I think we can start with you just to give just setting up the stage for our audience to just understand more about a little bit about your experience. I know when we talk about you, when this occurred in the 1990s with the Jack in the Box situation. So can you please just start by telling us about your background, telling us about your story? And I think I'm very excited because I think that's going to help us understand more about the importance of food safety. Sometimes we don't think about it as a very important aspect of our program in the meat plant. So thank you, Dr. Detwiler.
Sure. Food safety, some people look at food safety like, I don't know, maybe sports safety. Like it applies to a very specific sector, a very specific set of people. You only deal with it if you're in that kind of a thing. But food safety has a real rich history, and it is so connected to many other elements that we deal with every day. We can literally trace back to the 1700s, looking at laws that were passed in England, in Europe, dealing with food safety, because someone was either doing something hazardously or were doing something intentional to try to take advantage of someone, adding some kind of ingredient that was cheaper or easier or would make it look like it's more quantity, but it was actually harmful to people. So it's nothing relatively new. But HACCP, as you brought up, HACCP actually kind of dates back to the whole idea of putting man on the moon. Here was this national agenda. The administration, the Kennedy administration, during the Cold War, the idea of we want to get America to the moon first. Here was an operation that was, potentially limited in terms of the impact of food. You didn't want to put people into a sealed capsule and put them into space with an objective and have the entire mission be undone because of food that was going to make them sick. The same exact thing, almost the same period of time, could be seen in terms of the Navy with submarines. And I was joking with Dr. Phebus in terms of I was going to talk about submarine things, but you didn't want to put 150 some odd people in, like a spaceship, a sealed cylinder where operational status was important. And, here you had a nuclear reactor that could operate for a seemingly unlimited amount of time, but the crew was limited in terms of how much food was available to them. And you definitely did not want to have food that was going to make them sick. That's where I was in the late 80s and the early 90s. I was a nuclear engineer in a submarine, and I saw that we had food that was specifically labeled as inspected by an outside agency and was actually even labeled as not fit for human consumption, or sorry, for civilian consumption. I'm still a human if I was in the military at the time, but it wasn't fit for civilian consumption because it was specifically irradiated and inspected and set for the crew of the submarine. And right about the time when I was transitioning out of being a nuclear engineer on a submarine in the very early 1990s, I had never really thought about food safety too much. You definitely didn't read about it, hear about it. It wasn't in the news, kind of a thing. And then all of a sudden there was this Jack in the Box E. coli outbreak. And it was something, kind of like today we hear the pandemic talked about. We heard about, different viruses, the avian bird flu, or these different issues that kind of pop up that the media covers. And you tend to get this sense of, well, that's over there. That doesn't impact me. All I have to do is this, or I'll be fine. What are the chances? That kind of a thing. And, in 1993, I all of a sudden hear about this idea of E. coli. And for me, it was a scenario where I thought, well, I'll keep my family isolated. We won't go to Jack in the Box. We won't eat hamburgers at a fast food restaurant. We won't eat in Seattle. And I had a 9-year-old son and an 18-month-old son. And I was afraid of anything for my 9-year-old son at the time, because he ate outside of the house, like at school. And my youngest son, he had never eaten a hamburger, but he did get sick with E. coli from a classmate in his daycare facility. Because something that people didn't talk about was the idea of how some people are more vulnerable than others. Those who are very young or very old, those with compromised immune systems and maybe pregnant. And so I didn't think about that in terms of my young son. And they also didn't talk about the idea that it's not just from eating it. It could be from animal contact, waterborne exposure, person-to-person contact. And this idea that my youngest son here got sick from another kid in his daycare class who did eat a contaminated hamburger. Again, when you don't have that information, you don't think about those kind of things. So that 1993 Jack in the Box E. coli outbreak was not only a wake up for, I think, the nation and the industry in terms of food safety, and it clearly kicked off this food safety culture that we have today. But for me, it was one of those things where, within 30 days of my son being diagnosed, my memories of that period of time were holding him on my lap, and while he was crying, while he was sitting on a hospital bed, because he mistook his IV bag for a bottle. Seeing him put into a helicopter to be airlifted to Children's Hospital. Seeing him in Children's Hospital, dwarfed by wires and tubes and monitors. And then finally seeing him outside the hospital again in the world's smallest white coffin. That is not how someone should learn about, just how far the true burden of disease can be when it comes to a foodborne pathogen. And, after that, I basically looked at this in terms of there was a lot more to learn and a lot more to do. And I've literally spent the last 3 decades or so, working in different capacities and studying and helping and working with scientists and politicians and regulators, regulatory officials, food industry, and finally, in conclusion of my little piece here, I guess, being able to work with people like Dr. Phebus in terms of this bigger network of experts from many different perspectives and disciplines who are working to improve food safety beyond just simply taking care of the obvious, but to look towards the future such that perhaps we can improve how we predict, how we respond, how we understand this.
I think back to those early 1992. I graduated with my PhD and headed to Kansas State University for my new job as professor of food safety, food microbiology in November. And the first thing that I did when we got here was we were in the middle of the Jack in the Box outbreak at the first of it, and I jumped right into the lab with a colleague. We started doing Shigatoxigenic E. coli studies, E. coli 0157. And here I am in my 30th year at K-State, and I'm still working on Shigatoxigenic E. coli, along with COVID and along with Salmonella. Francisco, I remember the state of the industry at that time was quite different than it is today. You mentioned HACCP. We didn't have HACCP at that time. And, it was a lot of what some people referred to as poke and sniff inspection and things like that, which wasn't, a really good way of managing risk. And in the mid 90s, I had the great fortune to team up with Cargill and a company, an equipment manufacturer called Frigoscandia. And we developed the first true full carcass decontamination system that was totally validated. It's called steam pasteurization. And the reason I mention that is I had the great fortune, because it got a lot of national airplay, some of our research, but in around 1996, I had the fortune of meeting Nancy Donnelly and Mary Heersink, who were with an organization called, at the time, Safe Tables Our Priority. But both of their children, Alex Donnelly, became ill and died. Mary's son, Damien, became very ill, but he fortunately recovered, but had lifelong issues and still does. But I met those two ladies, and I felt, even though I knew and loved food safety at the time, I didn't have the connection. And then shortly after that, I had the opportunity to meet Darin. And I can't remember, Darin, how many years ago it was, but it's been over 20 years that I've known you, I think. And I found out about Riley, Darin's son. And I have to say, as a 30-year dedicated professor of food science and food safety, that those three people, Alex and his mother, Nancy, Damien and his mother, Mary, and then Darin and his son, Riley, have been the driving force of me doing what I do at the scale that I do it. And I also want to mention, and what I do is, develop and help companies institute interventions that can control, whether it's in meat or grain or whatever. But having said that, we still got so much to do, but we are in an environment today where I think people do rely and value food safety more than they did back when all of this happened. That's just my gut feeling, Darin, and I think you probably...
No, I agree with you 100%. I also think that we could look at a lot of different factors, but I think that it's amazing how different, like you were talking about Nancy Donnelly and Mary Heersink and myself. I actually tried to stop foodborne illness. It was called something else at the time, back in 1993, and later worked with Stop Foodborne Illness as a policy coordinator. But the industry has really changed how it looks at people like myself. I mean, there was a time where there were companies that would do anything they could do to avoid, having my voice be heard, and those same companies welcome me. Please come speak with us. Please come work with us, kind of a thing. But I think that a bigger picture is that not only has consumers' perspective of food safety changed as a priority overall, but I believe that the industry overall looks at the consumer as more of a stakeholder today than they did, 25, 30 years ago. It used to be that unless you owned stock in the company, you were over there. You were a separate entity, was not listened to. Today, perhaps with social media, perhaps with our food safety culture, perhaps with just changes in society and culture, that kind of a thing. Consumers are considered to be much more of a stakeholder in matters related to food safety and other food concerns, food authenticity, food sustainability. These are issues that today we all relate to differently, but they're all related.
Well, and circling back to Francisco's initial question for you and I to address is HACCP. And, what came out of the Jack in the Box outbreak was HACCP for the meat and poultry industry. And, if you have to understand, your associated hazards, have to figure out how to control them, and then have to document and verify that you are controlling them on a daily basis, that's science. And that has just continued to grow and develop. And, now we're doing HACCP for virtually all food systems. And, that's the evolution that I'm so happy to see. And I recall back in the late 90s when in Washington, D.C. at the USDA building, I was a young pup professor, academic, so I wasn't normally there, but I was on this day when USDA was meeting with all of the meat industry executives. And so I remember all of the vice presidents and presidents of the big companies there sitting in the cafeteria room having this conversation. And they all agreed right there on the spot to make food safety a joint effort and not to be competitive with anything related to food safety, even though these are super competitive, cutthroat type companies. They made that, and as I sit here and look over the 30 years, 25 years since that time, they have stuck to that. And I like to give the industry credit when they deserve it, and that is one thing that they deserve is some credit for what they did on food safety.
Since 1883, Ultrasource has been a trusted supplier to the food industry. Ultrasource provides superior kill floor, processing, packaging, and labeling equipment and operational supplies.
Yeah, and I do think like my experience is a completely different story when it compares to like 30 years ago when this all started. But I think that I really want to think like it's an example of how this occurred in the food system, but that's made the U.S. to have one of the greatest food safety programs as a country. I mean, it's amazing how everything changed and evolved from that situation. And when you can talk about traceability and how traceability it's a big thing now. Like you can basically go back and recall products that have been compromised and I think. Going back to your comment, Dr. Phebus, this evolution of safety that I think it's going to be like the title of this podcast because it's all about story. And I think going back also to Dr. Detwiler and when we had this conversation almost a year ago, that he told me like when that happened, unfortunately, he was not eating meat, right, Dr. Detwiler? So that transition from not eating meat and just blaming. What that happened. And then I think I admire that a lot because we were not that person like, I'm not gonna help anyone and I'm not gonna do anything for the industry and for other families. So you made that decision to say, now I'm gonna be a leader in the food industry, in the meat industry to help the government and the meat industry go forward and just be the best as I can tell.
Well, you got to realize that let's just say the 1990s, food safety was associated with the USDA, was associated with meat. We weren't yet at a point where we were associating it with cantaloupe and sprouts and romaine lettuce and cucumbers and peanuts and such a large list of foods that are all regulated by the FDA. And even though right after 1993 with Jack in the Box, the USDA made a couple of very significant choices. I was out in Washington, D.C., sitting down with not only the Secretary of Agriculture, but with Mike Taylor when he was with the FDA and with some of the other folks, H. Russell Cross and a lot of other influential people. 3 big priorities. One was to focus on consumer education, public education. Two was to rethink inspection in terms of being more science focused. Like what Dr. Phebus said, this idea of moving away from the organoleptic or the sniff and poke and relying on science a little bit more. But the third was quite surprising in 1994 when the USDA, Mike Taylor, stood in front of the meat industry and said that E. coli was basically going to be considered an illegal adulterant. That it's not something that's accidental. It's something that could be and should be preventable in our foods. And from that point on, the idea that it's not just a good idea to try to minimize this. It is a requirement. It is mandatory that we look at these critical control points. We look at things like temperature as a kill step and other inspection criteria. And with Jack in the Box, that's exactly what it came down to. All this meat was contaminated. It was shipped up the West Coast during a storm. At the time, they weren't tracking temperature of things being stored, and the power was out in Seattle, and a lot of the refrigerated meats were not kept at the right temperature. Thinking about the danger zone, keeping it below 40 degrees, and then they weren't cooking them at the restaurants long enough. They weren't thinking about that kill step. That's literally what it came down to, is the idea of if that kill step of cooking it to the right temperature had been applied, then this could have been avoided. And it's hindsight's one thing, but the idea of you brought up that I didn't eat meat for a while. Again, it's very easy to associate with meat and say, well, I'm not going to eat meat for a while. But if I look at over time all these other foods that were impacted, if I decided to avoid everything, there'd be very little left for me to eat. This food safety is not a meat thing. It's not a Jack in the Box thing. It's not a USDA thing. It is industry wide. It is all foods. It is all companies, great or small. I've since gotten sick from salmonella at a food safety conference, of all things. So no one's immune. Even though there's vulnerable populations, everyone can become sick. And, we need to think about that this is something that is a little bit more critical. I do think that the pandemic has probably put more people in a position to think about, they might not be using the words hazard analysis and critical control points, but when people were worried about masks and gloves, and well, if I go to the grocery store, if I bring food home, how can I make sure the package, cleaning the package, people were wiping down the packaging, and people looking at well, if I pump gas at the gas station, if I touch the handle, can I get sick from the handle? I think right or wrong, right? The thing is, people are thinking more about those critical control points in their daily activities when it comes to becoming sick or bringing an illness into the home, probably more so than ever before. I don't know if you think the same way, Dr. Phebus, but
I do. And, you and we talk fairly regularly, and I know that you are very interested, Darin, in international trade and policy and blockchain, supply chain management, and all of those things. And, that's always been an important part of the food industry long before Darin and I, got involved with it. But today it is part of the food system on steroids. And, in some ways you can see how you can use, the technology to improve food safety. But at the same time, you can see the challenges that exist, when you're bringing in ingredients from 40 different countries and trying to verify your supply chain. And thank goodness for big data and AI and all of the technologies that we currently have at our disposal. But, it really takes a whole new mindset, I guess, to manage it all. And, here, Darin and I both are in academia, and to think about how do you select and train the next generation of food safety specialists. I feel like I'm an old dinosaur. I'm still doing auger plates and things like that, where but we still have great impact. But looking forward, and with people like Frank Giannis at the FDA pushing the new era of food safety, I really think that we're in for some special times. I'm looking forward in a positive way, whether it's meat or flour or peanuts, as Darin mentioned. But I really think we have to look at food safety and across society and globalized in a whole different light now.
I like the quote that you have, Dr. Detwiler, and we can talk about your book and what made you write a book. But so the quote is, there will never be an end to pathogens in our food, but we can change the culture around the future of food safety. To do so, we require a Herculean effort, an enormous amount of work, strength, and courage.
It's amazing how some people can minimize it and some people can look at it in terms of how big the issue is. And I think that, we've already talked about how big and encompassing the issue is. But sometimes, we can talk about artificial intelligence and machine learning and blockchain and all that kind of stuff. And yet we know that people in their own homes don't have thermometers, or if they have them, they're rusting in a drawer somewhere, kind of a thing. We know that there are companies that are struggling to get people to wash their hands or to, follow certain protocols. And that sometimes the greatest intentions of the greatest leaders of industry are undone by people who they don't think that it's necessary to take a step or to do something. I've talked with companies where, someone didn't think it was important to say, we can't allow this product to go forward into the next stage of manufacturing, even though there might be an olive pit in it, kind of a thing. And, look at cost benefit analysis in terms of saying, well, that would be getting rid of $19,000 worth of an ingredient, kind of a thing. And then to find out that company, when they heard about it, it ended up spending, over $10 million in a recall to do the right thing. Whereas if someone, way down in the pyramid, their totem pole, if you will, had made a decision that was better. There was a case in Braintree, Massachusetts in 2014, where a large nationwide retailer, a food grocery store chain, continued to sell contaminated ground beef well after the USDA had sent them a letter saying that it needed to be recalled and needed to be taken off the shelves, because they didn't think that anyone had actually gotten sick from it. Why do this? And they kept selling it until the lawyers knocked on the door and basically proved that because they did not listen to the FDA request, someone died. An 8-year-old boy died from this. So it does take a lot of work and strength sometimes to work against economic pressures, to work against ROI, to stand up, even just to be a voice, to go to these conferences or to take these trainings. But it also takes courage. I think it takes a lot of courage, and that courage is a very human thing, a very human element that technology can't replace. And part of building that courage in the next generation, like Dr. Phebus was talking about, is this idea of understanding the true burden of disease, understanding what it means to be sick, what it means to be vulnerable, what it means, looking beyond statistics and data and numbers. When you really look at faces and stories and families and understand, what does this really look like? I think it's something that we have to continue to explore, because that's the only way we're going to combat this never-ending presence of pathogens in our food.
It seems like, Darin, when you really look at things at the fundamental level, just like in any industry, but particularly the food industry, it seems like it always comes back to a human element when we have a big problem. Whether it was someone who wasn't trained, or whether it was someone who intentionally skirted something because of a shortcut, or just a dumb decision that someone made. But that's always going to be there. But the more trained and high class ethical people that we put into the food industry, the better it's going to be for all of us. But part of that human element is the actual consumer. Darin mentions the thermometer. People make fun of me at barbecues and stuff here in Manhattan where I live, because I will pull out that thermometer while I'm grilling burgers for our cookout. And, so I've become the butt of a lot of jokes, but I like to take that opportunity to say why it's important to do it. And, it's just, I don't know. Some people just, kind of look at food safety as, something that is okay, but they're not going to put that effort toward it, or it's going to make their burger a little bit drier or whatever. But when you think about what the repercussions can be if you don't do it right, it's horrible to think about. I teach classes here. Introduction to Food Science is one of my favorite classes I teach. And, when you think about 9/11, 2001, I asked them how many people died in that terrorism event. And it's about 3,000. And that's the number of people who die every year in the United States of America from a foodborne disease. And we hardly even think about it, or we hardly even mention it, where we went to war for 20 years, when the 9/11 happened. So it's a different perspective, I know, but it's still something that's the way I think about things.
Well, two things really quick. One is, it's amazing how that number of 3,000, so essentially 48 million Americans get sick, 128,000 are hospitalized, and 3,000 die every year. That number has not changed in 3 decades, not even 1%. Very strange that number has not changed. With all of this culture and technology and focus and academia work on it. So either A, the numbers were never meant to change, or B, the numbers actually gotten worse, and we're keeping the numbers at bay as we go along. But you brought up the people laughing at you with their thermometer. My experience is, anytime I go to someone's house or a family gathering kind of a thing, it's amazing. Oh, Darin's here. Darin, I washed my hands. Darin, I just want you to know I washed my hands, kind of a thing. And I get it. I get it, but I recall, I think I actually told you about this, Dr. Phebus, being at an airport once of many times in the last while, and someone in the TSA line going, I can't wait until this is all over and we go back to not having the security at the airport. I'm like, in my head, you fool, we'll never go back to a lesser security. I think the same way about food safety. It's not going to be like one day we're going to go back to, we don't have to think about food safety. There will always be this growth of concern, especially as consumer behaviors change, our diversity and the commercially packaged and ready-to-eat foods, and the foods that come from all over the world, and the 75 plus ingredients in some of these foods, and how we change our behavior and culture and our overall relationship with food over time. It's going to continue to evolve.
We're almost getting to the end of this episode, but going back to making decisions that are driven by science, and I think that's one of the takeaway messages that I'm getting today. One last thoughts on following 30 years, look at 2050, and we continue to see this numbers that will be 9 billion people, will be basically the population will increase. What's your thoughts on the future of food safety to continue to grow as the food production continues to grow? Food safety will continue to evolve. What are some of the speculations on some of the changes that we can talk about? Maybe what we're studying right now on COVID, but I think with that, last thoughts can finalize this episode.
Let Dr. Detwiler go. He's writing a book about that.
Yeah, I think we're going to continue to see technology play a role in terms of meeting consumer expectations. That everything from traceability and transparency. Consumers, 30 years ago, we didn't talk about some of these, gluten-free, organic, kosher, well, maybe kosher, but there's so many things that we look at in our food today that we didn't look at ever before. And we want to have certifications. We want to have auditing and requirements and compliance elements met to not only support the why am I paying this much for this kind of food, but also I want to verify that if it's free of this allergen or if it's been tested for that, if it's been prepared that way, we want that. I think that we are going to see a significant growth in the digitization within the food industry when it comes to these elements. It may take a while. It may grow faster in larger companies than in smaller companies, and we'll see disruption of new companies that enter into the industry, and they're completely driven by digitization and that's why people want to use that product or buy from that company, is because of the technology that they use. I don't know if this is wishful thinking, but I also think that we're going to start to see the pendulum swing back a little bit. I think that we've grown too fast in terms of how much money we spend for food prepared outside of the home versus food that's prepared inside the home. And we have become far too distanced from our foods. And as we look at these food issues more and more, I think that people are going to look for not only for changes in policy, but also look more towards education in terms of growing some more of their own produce, or having their own chickens, their own eggs, whatever it is. I don't think that everyone's going to be doing this, but I do think that we're going to see a trend in that area, because it allows people to be closer to that kind of element of control and that democratic agency, if you will, that idea of I can use my land and resources to be a little bit more sustainable, to provide more for myself, and to have that assurance that it's not an apple or a cucumber or fill in the blank food. I don't know how long ago it was when it was picked. I don't know where it was raised. But if I grow it in my backyard, I know where it came from. I know that I didn't put pesticides on it. I know when it was picked, and I know when it's fresh to eat. I think we're going to end up seeing a little bit more of a growth in that area. And I'll sit here and say, prove me wrong over time.
I agree with everything you just said, 100%. Two things that I will add to finish off the conversation on this question is, I think we're going to continue to make massive advancements in analytical technology, particularly for toxins and bacteria and viruses, that, first of all, it's going to reveal much more clearly just what we're up against, but it will also help us to get risky product off the market and identified quicker and more effectively. So that's one thing. And the other is, and most people don't think about this at this point, but to me, working with the big industry the way I do, the aspect of water shortage, water sustainability, particularly here in the Midwest and the West Coast, is going to drive so much from food prices to food availability, but also food safety. Because if you think about it, if we just take the meat industry, for example, which is heavily concentrated here in the Midwest, we're using massive amounts of water to wash carcasses with antimicrobial food grade solutions and things, and clean sanitation, whatever, massive amounts of water. And that water is not going to be there forever, maybe not even in the next 5 years. So I think those will be two major driving forces relative to food safety and the food supply.
And Dr. Phebus, you brought up the faster analytics and those indicators. It goes back to that quote that I brought up. We can have all the indicators and all the speed, but if we're not having leadership making the ethical decisions, we don't want to have people that sit on this information, and even though we can have this information faster, not act upon it, not verify that our systems will react these ways. Like the grocery store example I brought up. Here you had the indicator from the FDA. There's your problem from this lot number. Here's the issue. Please do this. Someone can easily decide, I don't think I need to. And in making that decision, the worst case scenario can happen. So there has to be a marriage, if you will. Have that speed of technology, predictive analytics, all the data at your disposal, if you will, at your fingertips. But you have to make sure that the people behind that, the people who are figuring out what questions to ask, when to ask those questions, how often do I ask those questions, and when I get those answers, what do I do with those answers? That's the most critical thing. No matter what technology we want to label it or how we want to use that technology, the human element will always be the primary focus that we have to continue to support.
And I'm happy to see the young generation like Francisco going out and doing the things that you're doing now, Francisco. Wish you luck in your position. And just this week, I've had 2 students get hired in the food industry. It's going to be just, that's the payoff for me is seeing this new generation that's going to get us to where we need to be.
Absolutely. I think that communication aspect and consumer education, this type of platforms, I think they're going to be so helpful for to reach those folks that, oh, this is why it's important to maybe follow the recommendations from USDA. So this communication between industry, government, and academia, I think that has to happen. So whether we like it or not, but I think this is a good platform to do so. So thank you a lot for joining us today on this podcast. I think this is a very special episode to me. And I think a lot of folks will benefit from this conversation to understand more about the evolution of food safety, where we were 25, 30 years ago, and why we did what we did on the industry standpoint, but also all these advancements in academia and all this research that we continue to see to tackle these pathogens in the food industry, understand more about how they grow and how they multiply. And I think this is great. Thank you, Dr. Phebus and Dr. Detwiler, for joining us. Do you have any last thoughts so we can wrap this up?
Well, I'll say one thing. It's a really honor for me to be on here with Darin. He has made a very important influence in my career, my professional life, and I appreciate what he does and others like him. I work a lot with industry, but I have the feeling of protecting citizens and consumers in my heart at all the time. And, I want to just say one last thing, because I know you work with the industry a lot, Francisco, that I appreciate those folks in industry who value and step up and invest in their own companies. And I think we see more and more of that today. And, obviously there are some people who don't quite get there, and we need to push them along too. So
I think I just quickly say that I think Dr. Phebus would agree with me. We interact with people with an incredibly wide range of job titles. From lawyer to scientist to academic to R&D to quality assurance. There's so many titles, and moms and dads, exactly. But I think that one of the things that I've tried to support is the idea of after the 1906 book The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. Many people recall that. There was a London Times literary review that talked about how what Upton Sinclair wrote about was very real. And this literature review guy wrote that the things described by Mr. Sinclair happened yesterday or happening today, tomorrow, and the next day until some Hercules comes to cleanse the filthy stable. And that was in 1906. And I think it's extremely applicable even today in 2021. And this idea of Hercules, we know there's not a Hercules, especially in this world of DC and Marvel superheroes and that kind of stuff. But I do think that this Herculean effort, this idea that there are people who look at people who can make a difference, who can say something, who can do something, who could have prevent them from living with a chair forever empty at their family table as heroes. And I think it's important to make sure that people, whatever their job title is, who are working to improve food safety, realize that they are seen by people as heroes in their effort, and never underestimate what they do based on what their job title is or how fancy their office may be or how much they're paid or not. But the impact that they have on people's lives, it is heroic, it is Herculean, and it will always be seen by many to be nothing less than that.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you a lot for your help, for joining us today, and we'll see you the next time.
Okay.
Thank you very much.